Europe rallied through NATO, but also through individual countries in stepping up its own defense positioning, whether giving aid to Ukraine or bolstering their own forces. There has been in the past almost 3 years now a sign of Europe finding a place that was necessary and vital and trying to fill it. So, in a sense, Vladimir Putin failed. That's part of the reason why Kyiv still stands today. And let's not forget that. But now we face November 2024, Vladimir Putin's possibly last gamble to try to avoid a stalemate and to try to avoid the frustration of his hopes was Donald Trump back in the White House. That it's not a question of European weakness or of Europe not getting its act together. It's that the U.S. no longer will be able to get its act together because of that very chaotic, unpredictable man who happens to be, in effect, and has been for years, subservient to Vladimir Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. He's also Editor-in-Chief at EA Worldview and is a regular commentator for Frontline. Scott, great to see you. Thank you very much for your time today. Let's start with the obvious. What do you think of the Trump presidency and what it will mean for Ukraine?
I think it means, to get to the conclusion at the start, that we are looking at the effective partition of Ukraine, something very similar to a Cold War situation that we had between West Germany and East Germany. What are the reasons for that? Right now, Ukraine is continuing to resist that 32.5 month Russian invasion. Rather than falling in the first few days or weeks, as Vladimir Putin intended, most of the country still stands free, even when the Russians are trying to take more territory, especially in the east in the Donetsk region. They're meeting that resistance. The Ukrainians continue to persist. The Ukrainians control part of Western Russia, the Kursk region, in the first operations inside the Soviet Union or Russia since World War II. But still, we have to recognize that Russia has Crimea, has occupied it since 2014. We have to recognize that despite the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022, they control part of the south of Ukraine, the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, including the port city of Mariupol, devastated in spring 2022 after 12 weeks of siege and bombing. And they control much of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and are trying to seize more. Where does the Trump administration fit into all of this? That resistance by Ukraine has been maintained by international support, not just the US, Europe, including the European Union, including individual countries such as the UK, countries in other regions, Asian countries, countries such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, have provided either humanitarian or military assistance. Countries through the United Nations, through the G7, through the G20, through the World Bank, have maintained Ukraine not just as a fighting force, but as a government, as a functioning institution providing public services for an embattled people. But even though there are many who are involved in this coalition, the US is, of course, one of the largest forces. It is the largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine and one of the largest suppliers of economic and financial aid, either directly or through international institutions. And a key moment that we survived, or that Ukraine survived earlier this year, was in April of 2024, when the Trumpists, who have been a vocal and arguably a prevailing force within the Republican Party, blockaded assistance for 6 months, threatened Ukraine at that point with extinction of U.S. support. That blockade was finally broken in April by those Republicans who would join those Democrats to say that this was important, this was necessary, and they authorized almost $61 billion in aid. But even as they were doing that, you had a presidential candidate in Donald Trump and his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, who were effectively saying, we will cut Ukraine off. Now, there's a bit of a central background to this. The story that has come out is that Vladimir Putin, to whom Donald Trump was at least beholden, including for assistance in the 2016 campaign, a man who Trump admired, in July of 2017, he pulled Trump aside at the G7 summit, the G20 summit in Germany. They had a Private meeting, no advisors there, only translators. For 30 minutes, Putin regaled Trump about why Russia should be allowed to pursue its hybrid war in Ukraine, why it should carry out the propaganda, why it should carry out the support of the separatists in the East, why it was entitled to hold on to Crimea, which it had seized illegally 3 years earlier. Trump listened, and when he spoke about it to those around him, his aides, he parroted the Putin's line on Ukraine. 2 years later, this needs to be mentioned, there's the other side of this, the domestic side of this, in the sense that Donald Trump, who wanted to be reelected, told the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, in a phone call, you dish disinformation on Joe Biden. Now, Zelensky refused. Trump then blackmailed Kyiv by cutting off military aid. It was only when that phone call was exposed by a whistleblower and when Trump faced resistance that he allowed the military aid to proceed. Of course, he was subsequently impeached. He was saved from conviction by the Republicans over that incident. That's the background. And Trump doesn't forget grievances, and he doesn't forget those whom he supports and those he dislikes. And what we have had in 2024 in the run up to the election was Trump disparaging Zelensky as a salesman making a pitch to take American money. Every time he comes to us, he walks away with billions of dollars. Now, that's both a pitch that Trump makes and as well as being a parroting of the Russian line that Zelensky exploits people, it's Trump's transactional politics. Trump does not believe in U.S. foreign policy through alliances. He does not believe in working with partners. He believes in it as an individual process in terms of what makes Donald Trump look good.
In that line, though, isn't it true to say that what Donald Trump might say on the campaign trail in rhetoric often translates into something very different in actions?
Except, Kate, that when it comes to what Donald Trump has done in terms of his actions away from the cameras, has genuinely been supportive of the Russian line. He has never come out and challenged the Russian occupation of Crimea. He has never actually come out and challenged the Russian hybrid warfare to split the country. And he has, to bring it up to the current date, said in private what he says in public about Zelensky, that he sees Zelensky as someone who is doing nothing more than to take American money. And Trump has said privately, as well as publicly, of course, I can end this war by supporting peace talks. Now, we need to be very clear, both that public and private presentation of peace talks are not genuine talks in the sense that both sides come to the table and you have a broker, they listen to both sides, you try to find compromise, you try to find room for negotiation. Those peace talks will be on the Kremlin's terms. And the Kremlin's terms will start with a recognition of their annexation of not only Crimea, but of possibly all four regions that they claim. Kherson, Zaporizhia in the south, Luhansk and Donetsk in the east. The Russians don't even control parts of those regions, but they will call upon the recognition of full control of those regions, as well as a guarantee that Ukraine cannot become part of a bloc to protect its military security, a guarantee that Ukraine will not be able to go into NATO, and probably a guarantee that Ukraine will not be able to go into the European Union for its economic future.
All of this, though, presumes that Donald Trump can actually force this upon an unwilling President Zelensky.
And that is where the rubber is going to hit the road. Now, the problem for Zelensky is that he's got military forces who are exhausted. They are flat out exhausted. Remember, Ukraine's much smaller than Russia. Ukraine's about 75. Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine's much smaller than Russia. Ukraine is a country of just over 40 million people. You're talking about a Russian population which is even 4 times the size of that. Russia can mobilize far more men than the Ukrainians, especially when Russia's willing to empty its prisons, when it's willing to take elderly men even as part of the fighting forces, when it's willing to take mercenaries, such as the Wagner group. Ukraine does not have the equipment that Russia has, even with Western assistance. They have a shortage of artillery and artillery shells. So if the U.S. removes its element of the military assistance behind it, that exhausted force faces even greater challenges. And of course, what you have is a real symbol. If U.S. pulls aside to the rest of the international community, well, we're out of here. Because remember, there are those who are Trump supporters or they're aligned with Trump who have tried to block aid, for example, within Europe. Viktor Orban of Hungary, for example, uh, Robert Fico of Slovakia. Now, they'll be bolstered by that position that Trump takes. So I think Ukraine will face a challenge to continue, but I think also, and this is what I'm watching for, I think this will be probably a catalytic moment for Europe, for both the European Union and European members of NATO. Do they stand up to the Trump administration if this is what he does?
And that is the question. Minds will be focused at this meeting of the European political community in Hungary that's taking place. It was launched following Russia's full-scale invasion. President Zelensky is there to appeal to Europe's leaders to stand by Ukraine, notably, obviously, hosted by Kremlin-leading Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. This presumably is quite an important moment. What do you think can be achieved here?
I think the effort at the European political community will be to try to maintain both publicly and in terms of actual private commitments that support to Ukraine for the moment to try to prevent Russia from breaking through on the front lines, to possibly give Ukraine additional fighting capabilities, because remember, they still hold territory in Russia. So to help them maintain that, but also to maintain the economic and financial support. I also think there's an open question that should be mentioned here. I'm not sure if it'll come up the European political community, but it's definitely coming up around this because it has for months, which is, will Ukraine finally be allowed to use Western supplied long range missiles to hit Russian targets well inside Russia? Now, Ukraine using its own capabilities, using drones, for example, has wreaked a significant amount of damage on Russian oil refineries, on Russian supply and logistics positions, and on Russian military bases, naval bases, air bases, army positions. But it could do much more if it was allowed to use the British Storm Shadows and the French Scalp long range missiles. Washington has refused to allow that so far, even though Britain has indicated it is willing to give that permission. The question here for the Europeans, whether it's at this meeting today or beyond it, is do they continue to press the case? Because the question for the Biden administration in its last 2 months is, do they finally lift the ban? Because it's far easier, of course, it's a far better position for Ukraine if it goes into January, having had that permission to strike Ukrainian positions, which puts the onus on Trump to try to reimpose the ban.
And interestingly, President Zelensky has been using the presence of North Korean troops in Kursk and the engagement of them with Ukrainian forces as a reason to say, come on, give me those long range permissions, so that and setting out what he says are the bases where those North Koreans are stationed inside Russia, and that this is a moment that the international community really has to make its mind up, get its finger out, and say something about this. Could this be a turning point?
Well, so let's recognize that in a way this is a PR lever, and you understand it's a PR lever for Zelensky, who is trying to get these commitments on long range missiles on air power to try to shift the balance of the fight in the skies, something that could be instrumental in putting Russia on the defensive. It's a useful lever for him to say, look, this is how far Vladimir Putin is going. He will bring these North Koreans in, recognizing that these troops are from a power which is ostracized by much of the international community, derided by much of the international community, seen as a threat by much of the international community, including because of its nuclear capability. So he's putting that message out to the United States. He's putting it out to the Europeans. He's putting it out to others to say, look, this is why you need to back us. And that is the politics you would expect. But it's also a very real security question here. And it's an inversion of what we were told. The false pretext for Russia to invade Ukraine was that Russia was facing the threat of an invasion from a foreign force, from NATO. And there are a lot of people, whether well-intentioned or otherwise, who parroted that line in the UK, in the US, and other countries. Oh, Russia's fighting a defensive war. Now, here we are in 2024, and no government has authorized forces to fight alongside the Ukrainians. In fact, they've explicitly rejected that. Yet Russia has now taken what we believe to be about 10,000, 11,000 North Korean troops with the prospect of more. So it's actually Russia who has internationalized the front line. So I think that's a pretty good selling point, both in terms of where Ukraine is, but also where Europe is. Because let's realize that in the context of this is not just about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is someone who carried out a war against another neighbor, Georgia, in 2008. He is something who has carried out cyber war against the Baltic states, notably Estonia, since 2007. He has threatened to carry out war with other NATO members, including Poland, if they don't do the right thing. So it's not just a question of Putin thumping his chest here. He has shown the intention that he will go farther with Ukraine by bringing in foreign forces. Would he go farther if he decided to raise the military stakes with others in Central and Eastern Europe who are members of NATO?
Do you think that the results of the presidential election in the US provides a moment and the prospect of Donald Trump being much more vocal about contribution, how much money individual alliance members of NATO spend on their defense, for example? Do you think this is the wake-up call that Europe really did need to step up its own security and cooperation and defense spending, but also to step up support for Ukraine so that it can continue the war, irrespective of whether the US provides support?
Europe has been preparing for this moment. I would argue this dark moment, not just because of Ukraine, but because of a range of issues. They've been preparing for it for months. And I know that from EU officials and officials of individual countries who have talked about what's been going on behind the scenes. And it would have been negligent not to prepare for a Trump victory because European officials knew it was possible, if not probable. So no, this isn't a wake up call in terms of, Trump winning. If anything, the wake up call for Europe and the EU as part of that was in February 2022. In that moment when Vladimir Putin launched a full scale military invasion of Ukraine, he put the marker down, which is, will you not only back Ukraine, but will you organize yourselves? And you know what? This is the answer. Putin lost that. He lost that gamble, um, sometimes way too slowly, with a lot of bureaucracy. Those who know the EU know what happens. Europe did rally. Europe did rally in terms of the financial and economic assistance. Europe rallied through NATO, but also through individual countries in stepping up its own defense positioning, whether giving aid to Ukraine or bolstering their own forces. There has been in the past almost 3 years now a sign of Europe finding a place that was necessary and vital and trying to fill it. So, in a sense, Vladimir Putin failed. That's part of the reason why Kyiv still stands today. And let's not forget that. But now we face November 2024, Vladimir Putin's possibly last gamble to try to avoid a stalemate and to try to avoid the frustration of his hopes was Donald Trump back in the White House. That it's not a question of European weakness or of Europe not getting its act together. It's that the US no longer will be able to get its act together because of that very chaotic, unpredictable man who happens to be, in effect, and has been for years, subservient to Vladimir Putin.
That was going to be my next question. How would you judge the relationship and the understanding between the two? Does Donald Trump have any influence over Putin?
Uh, Donald Trump has no influence over Vladimir Putin. Very few people have influence over Vladimir Putin. But in the case of Donald Trump, especially, in addition to being a transactional politician, what can I get out of this? Donald Trump is someone who admires autocrats, and he just does. Whether you want to support him or oppose him, let's just state the fact. He is an admirer of China's Xi Jinping. He has spoken with fondness of how Xi Jinping is president for life, and wouldn't it be great if you could have that in America? He is an admirer of North Korea's Kim Jong-un. He no longer calls him Little Rocket Man. He says he's a man who's done great things for his people. He is an admirer of Viktor Orban, someone whom he had at Mar-a-Lago in Florida during the presidential campaign to show that admiration. And yes, he's an admirer of Vladimir Putin. He has said that publicly since 2015 when he ran for office. And that wasn't because he'd been compromised by the Russians. He genuinely believes that.
President Zelensky's message, though, of congratulations to President-elect Trump was very public, quoting phrases like peace through strength to appeal to Donald Trump. Of course, you mentioned earlier that Donald Trump had called him the greatest salesman on earth. If you take into account that this is a president that does diplomacy, does international relations via transaction, everything is a deal to him. What do you think President Zelensky could do to appeal to that, to improve his and his country's position?
President Zelensky's congratulations to Donald Trump, almost as soon as Trump was declared the winner in the United States, was an attempt to use the transactional approach that Trump favors. This is a congratulations of Trump personally, not of the U.S. system, not of the State Department. It's, you did great. You did great. And, Zelensky knows that. Zelensky knows history really, really well. He always refers to history when he goes to each individual country, and he knows their politics well as well. He studies up on this. But Zelensky's message is not just a message to Trump. This is really important to get across. It's a message to those beyond Trump, especially those in the U.S. Congress and in Trump's potential cabinet. There are certain individuals who Trump may name as Secretary of State or who may name as the Secretary of Defense who have been supportive of Ukraine aid uh, while they've been in Congress or while they've had other government positions. So Zelensky, in a way, is sort of trying to put his hands on the scales of the Trump transition and say, wouldn't it be great if you had this person in, right? It's also a message, of course, to Republicans in Congress, because remember, most Republicans in Congress, despite Trump's threats, despite his bluster, most of them supported aid to Ukraine even during that 6-month blockade. It was Trumpists who were in the minority who continued to block it. So he's trying to get those Republicans in Congress, in the new Congress, to put pressure on Trump to allow the aid to continue, to not cut it off, and even possibly to try to generate the strength for a new aid bill that somehow you sell to Trump as being in his best interest.
And what will you be looking for then in President-elect Donald Trump's appointments in the coming days to indicate his foreign policy agenda, and in particular that towards Ukraine?
What I'm going to be looking for in the Secretary of State is rather you get a congressman, and there are a couple who are in the frame who have supported the Ukraine aid package in the past, albeit possibly with the proviso that you need more accountability for the aid. That's a clause that they often put in there. Or whether he appoints someone like Richard Grenell. Grenell's former U.S. ambassador to Germany. He is a former head of the intelligence establishment under Trump. Uh, I think he'll be very hostile to aid to Ukraine because I think he is a diehard Trumpist ideologue. He's also someone who I'm just going to tell you from the officials I work with, Grinnell's not easy. He's not easy to deal with. And so I think, with Trump, what you always look about is you look at, do you have any adults in the room? Do you have anybody that can continue to make the case for a rational U.S. policy, a sensible U.S. policy? Trump had that in the first term, even as he was bouncing here, there, and everywhere and saying crazy stuff, because he had Jim Mattis as the defense secretary, former four-star general. He had the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Initially, he had H.R. McMaster, another military man, as national security advisor. He had John Kelly, another general, as White House chief of staff. But here, of course, is the open question. He fired all of those individuals. He insulted all of those individuals. And one of those individuals, John Kelly, as well as the head of the U.S. military at the time, uh, General Milley, have said that Trump is a fascist. Now, will there be adults in the room in 2025, including on the issue of Ukraine? Or will Trump surround himself with loyalists, including those who will allow him to pursue those self-interested, even autocratic impulses, rather than supporting U.S. foreign policy and supporting the causes of the just and of the valiant around the world?
And if he does, as is being suggested by some analysts, surround him by yes men and women who will not challenge him, where does that take us?
It takes us into what is one of the crisis moments in world history, outside of a global war, so since 1945, and recognizing the other critical challenges we face, like climate change, for example. But beyond that, you're talking about an episode which, of course, not only will determine the future of Ukraine for some time to come, will not influence the future of Europe for some time to come, it will decide upon the fact about whether we have an international system in which, even if we disagree, even if we have disputes, we play by the rules of the game, where we try to find a win-win outcome through partnership and alliance, or whether we pursue a narrow, self-interested win-lose approach to international politics. A win-lose approach which isn't even based on the interest of the nations, but it could be based on the interest of one person's ego. I personally don't think Donald Trump is a fascist. I don't think we're talking about a 1930s Hitler or Mussolini. I think he's a wannabe autocrat. I'm not sure he can be an effective autocrat because he's chaotic, he's disorganized, he is not consistent. And an autocrat needs to be those things to enforce his will. But what Donald Trump can do is he can simply scorch the earth of all those institutions and all those arrangements and of all the decency that we've tried to maintain for going on almost 80 years to make sure that we don't have a place which is simply war and deprivation and perpetual conflict.
Just very briefly, Scott, we have to finish in about 3 minutes, but I just wanted to ask you a question about NATO. What do you think a Trump presidency means for NATO? Is it going to bolster it? Because as it has been argued by the former head of the Secret Intelligence Service here in the UK, it could be good because it could persuade more countries and alliance members to spend more of their GDP on defence under the threat perhaps from Trump, or it could lead to the alliance being completely dysfunctional should Donald Trump decide to withdraw militarily from the alliance.
Setting aside the pernicious misinformation that NATO members only began to come together and spend money, 2% of GDP, because of Donald Trump. NATO members had made that commitment in 2014 and were moving toward it well before Donald Trump tried to effectively threaten people into doing this. I think NATO does face that challenge of, can it work together as that effective alliance where each country takes its interest into that collective interest and makes not only the commitment to spend the money, but it makes the planning in terms of how that money is to be used. It makes the planning in terms of how forces are to be deployed, where it considers the forms of warfare beyond the battlefield, cyber warfare, information warfare, hybrid warfare. And I think those challenges were there before February 2022, but they've been accentuated, they've been accelerated. And I think that planning has to be done, recognizing that Donald Trump may try to sabotage it at any point. So you make that planning amongst yourselves, and then you make that planning with U.S. officials. You will have career U.S. officials who are not Trumpist. You'll have American military, American diplomats. You've got to reach out and make connections with those people. You have got to set up the defense lines if Trump decides to try to tear everything down.
Scott, there we must leave it. Scott Lucas, thank you very much for your time. It's been great speaking to you.
Thank you so much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.